February 13th. I hope you know that tomorrow is Valentine's Day. Hope that doesn't come to you as a surprise, especially if you have a Valentine that you would like to be kind to or express your love to. I did wear my heart tie today, so we're all good to go with that. And anyway, we continue our study on Joseph, and we've been talking about how to avoid life's pitfalls. And Joseph certainly had lots of them. He went through quite a few things in his life, but he did always end up on top. And that was because, as we've read in the scripture and as we've talked about, he ended up on top because God was with him, and God would show favor to him and shine upon him. And so therefore he was always able to rise to the top. But he was also faithful to God, and he always did what he knew was right. So we've looked at so far three things in his life. We looked at his brother's betrayal, and they sold him into slavery. That's number one here on the poster. And then we also looked at, let's see, I can't read that one. Temptation, as Potiphar's wife had lusted after him, and he couldn't avoid her advances and got himself in trouble and got thrown in prison. Then last week we looked at injustice, and you might say, well, his whole life was injustice. Well, not entirely, because things are about to turn around for him. But the injustice, and that was the cupbearer and the baker, Pharaoh's chief servants, and they ended up in jail where Joseph was, where he was in charge, and they had dreams, and Joseph interpreted the dreams, and he was really in prison unjustly because he had not done what he was accused of doing, and so therefore he wanted the chief cupbearer to express that to Pharaoh when he got out. Well, because the baker, as you remember, lost his life, the cupbearer was restored to his life, and so it tells us that the cupbearer forgot, and that word it doesn't mean he just forgot where he was, forgot what happened, but it does mean that perhaps the opportunity didn't come for him to say, oh, by the way, I met Joseph, and consider his case again. Bring him back, maybe up for parole or anything, do something for him. And it just didn't come up. So then we move on a little bit, and we see where Pharaoh has a dream, and his magicians, he summons them to come in and help, and they can't interpret it. And so lo and behold, the cupbearer says, oh yeah, I forgot. Well, maybe not, but he said, I know there's a guy in prison. His name's Joseph, and he's the head of the prisoners, and the chief guard there. He trusts him to take care of everything. Pretty sharp guy. You might want to ask him. And so what happened? Well, Joseph's been in jail. I'm sure didn't have cable TV and didn't have, all the good stuff that maybe they have in prison now. He was treated as a prisoner, even though he was given authority. And so had to get him out, had to clean him up, had to shave him to be presentable before Pharaoh. And so they did all that, put some clothes on him, and brought him to Pharaoh. And then he began to interpret Pharaoh's dream. And so that's kind of where we pick up today. And you might want to go back and read all of Genesis chapter 41 so that you can get a pretty good perspective and a view of what is really going on. And by the way, I would just always remind you to keep a Bible in hand. Anytime you're studying the Bible, don't just depend upon what others say. It's good to read the Bible, and you never know how God might speak to you. So we're going to pick up in verse 28 of chapter 41 is where our lesson focus will come from. And um, we're going to see how when we are going through um, hard times, which is the title. That's number 4 up here. Hard times. We're going through hard times. We really need some advice and some encouragement on what to do. And so the first thing we're going to see is that we should seek God's wisdom, and that's what happened between um, Joseph and Pharaoh when Pharaoh approached Joseph and asked him. He wasn't, he might have thought he was asking for Joseph, like Joseph was the authority, but Joseph reminded him, "No, I'm not the one. God's the one who's able to do that. And if God chooses to let me know, that's on God." And that's what he had done with the cupbearer and the baker as well. So, beginning in verse 28, it says, "It is just as I told Pharaoh." He's already interpreted the dream. He's already told him this is what it means. He says it here. He says, "God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt." So they're going to have 7 good years, 7 abundant years. Matter of fact, 7 years, that are bumper crops, that are records. And then he said, after them, 7 years of famine will take place, and all the abundance in the land of Egypt will be forgotten. Then he says, the famine will devastate. And if you don't have that word devastate circled in your Bible, just circle it, because it's going to come up again. It says the famine will devastate the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because of the famine that follows it. For the famine will be very severe. Since the dream was given twice to Pharaoh, it means that the matter has been determined by God, and he will carry it out soon. So what is Joseph getting at here? Well, the dream, Pharaoh had the dream, and you might remember the things that happened in his dream. The first part of the dream was he was on the Nile, the banks of the Nile. Of course, 4 months out of the year, the Nile overflows. It floods. And that the silt that comes from, remember it's south of the equator, so everything's coming from the north or from the south and moving north. And so it floods through there. Everything floods, and it all the silt that comes from that direction, it goes throughout the Nile. It has over centuries has made it extremely rich and fertile, and it just kind of has covered the desert. And so there's this broad area through there around the Nile that is tillable, that is highly producing things, and it's just a great lush place. And so in that time frame, then people who work the land there know that when there's water and it's flooded and things are good, that crops are going to grow, and it's going to produce a huge amount. So 7 cows. He's at the Nile and he has this dream: 7 fat cows, and come up out of the water, and whoa, man, they're like cows he's never seen before. They are, really, really unbelievable. And then 7 skinny cows. He says they're the worst cows he's ever seen. We used to say they look like death warmed over. And they come up out of the Nile and they eat the fat cows. And you'd think, oh, well, they eat the fat cows, they'd be fat. No, they're skinnier than they were when they ate. And so what does it mean? Well, there's going to be 7 years of famine, or feasting, and 7 years of abundance. And then there's going to be 7 years of famine. And you're not even going to remember how good it was before. The famine will be so bad. And that word devastate, it means the famine will devastate. That is just an ugly term. It means that it will erase it from your memory, that it won't even be there. And you think, how can that be? You just had 7 great years. You've got them on the books. Yeah, but the bad years are going to be so bad that there's no comparison. And so then, to affirm it to him, God gave him another dream. And so he dreamed not only of the cows, but he dreamed of the 7 plump ears of grain. and stalks of grain, and 7 scrawny ears, hardly any grain on them, came and devoured the 7 plump grain ears, and then um, the same thing was true, wasn't it? And so, because Pharaoh gave him the dream twice in 2 distinct modes, one was cattle, one was grain. Then Joseph interpreted the dream as God allowed him to. That said, it means that God gave it to you twice. It means it's happening. It's affirming it. You didn't just have a pepperoni pizza at midnight before you went to sleep. You had you you really had a dream, and what it means is that God's going to do it soon. It's about to start. So they sought God's wisdom, and that's really the key in that, isn't it? Was that Joseph, he made it clear that it was not his interpretation, but that it was God's interpretation. You think too about the time when Pharaoh had magicians who could do that, but they sure couldn't in this case. And what does that remind you of? Well, down the road, Moses is going to be born, and he's going to come back, and God's going to give him the opportunity to lead the people out of bondage, out of Egypt, and in that, he's going to go through a similar thing with Pharaoh's magicians, isn't he? He's going to get there, and God's going to command him to do something, and the magicians can do it. So, was it uncommon for Pharaoh to have these magicians that were there? Well, they had it in Joseph's day, didn't they? And later on, they had it in Moses' day. Okay, so seek God's wisdom. It made a great impression on Pharaoh that not only did Joseph know the truth of it, but it made an impression on him that Joseph's God was perhaps greater than Egypt's gods. Well, so we're going to move right along here then and go to the next section, which not only do we need to seek God's plan, but we need to follow, or seek God's wisdom, but we need to follow God's plan. When God gives us a plan and we understand what it means and what it is, then we need to walk in it. We need to step in His direction and do it His way. So we jump down a few years, not a few years, a few verses. Jump down a few verses from 32 all the way to 47, and it just fills in some gaps in there about how Pharaoh was impressed with Joseph's God, Yahweh, and then how God is able to deal with certain situations and circumstances, and so out of that, we also see where he is looking for someone who can do this, who can. Well, I guess he asked Joseph for advice, and Joseph said, "You need somebody who's going to store up things over the next 7 years, so you'll have plenty over the 7 years of famine." And Pharaoh's saying, "I wonder who could do that." Oh, how about you, Joseph? Sure enough, and he gets selected to do that. And Pharaoh's so impressed that he makes him, second in command. No one in the land is more powerful than Joseph. Here he is, this sold into slavery Hebrew boy. Hebrew means sojourners or means travelers. They're flighty people. And here he is, and he ends up here in Egypt, and look what happened to him. God has blessed him again. And so here he is in charge of things. So we pick up then in verse 47, and it says, "During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced outstanding harvests. Joseph gathered all the excess food into the land of Egypt during the 7 years and put it in the cities." They stored it up. Of course, I don't think Joseph was the only one scooping grain. Okay, I believe that everyone was doing that, and everyone was doing their part to make sure that they didn't waste any over these 7 years. I believe that they learned to be good stewards in this time, knowing that 7 years of famine was coming. It says, so Joseph stored up grain in such abundance like the sand of the sea. Now that's probably literal. I don't think he had more grain than the sand of the sea, but he had a lot. They stored up quite a bit. As a matter of fact, you know the story, and they stored up so much that our surrounding countries, surrounding nations, came there to buy food, and they had plenty throughout the famine. That says a lot, doesn't it? They had plenty for others to buy. Um, when you think about Joseph's father, Jacob, and named Israel, and you think about his whole clan and how many of them there were, gobs of them, and they had abundant animals and things. And can you imagine the caravan of his brothers who came to buy grain? Well, we're going to look that on down the road when he gets reunited with them. But they came to Egypt to buy grain. And can you imagine how many sacks they had on and how many donkeys they had that they went to get that for in order to feed themselves? So a lot. So it says, like the sand of the sea, that he stopped measuring it because it was beyond measure. Sorry, I had to get a little drink there. My throat was beginning to get a little ticklish, a little dry. So the land produced outstanding harvests, and more than they knew what to do with. And they were storing it like madmen, so much so that they stopped measuring it. In other words, once they had counted that they had plenty, then they just kept putting it away. I think that's what it means that they stopped measuring, was that they actually, he said, we're going to put away a fifth of it every year of the produce. So we're going to use 4/5 of it, of what it is, to feed ourselves and to live comfortably. We're going to put away a fifth every year so that at the end of 7 years, we're going to have plenty. And sure enough, they had plentier than plenty. Okay. Sorry. So they started in the cities, and they were blessed in many, many ways. Well, then we get to the third section, and we see where Genesis chapter 41, verses 50 through 54, that you can be fruitful even in famine. Even if you're going through hard times, as is the title of our lesson, if you will trust God and keep your eyes on him, he can help you through. So we need to be fruitful even in the famine. Here's the verses. 2 sons were born to Joseph before the years of famine arrived. And by the way, we missed some verses there where back before the last section we read, where Joseph, Pharaoh, allowed him to take a wife from a city of On, O-N, and took a wife from there. He had 2 sons, and so we're going to read about that here in this passage, and being fruitful even in the famine. It says, 2 sons were born to Joseph before the years of famine arrived. Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. So in the city of On was like the biggest worship center of the sun god Re. And her father was the priest there. He took a pagan wife, but we get the impression, because of Joseph's character, would he have endured a pagan wife unless she converted to believe in Yahweh God? And so you get the impression that because Pharaoh had such been influenced by the vision and the interpretation of the dreams that Yahweh had given, that there was a religious turning in all of Egypt. And so I would believe that the wife that he was given was one that he would definitely have an agreement of faith with at this point. So they had 2 children. First one named Manasseh. Manasseh means he who causes to forget. And so this child that was born to him brought him some joy, brought him some satisfaction in life, and therefore it caused him to forget for a moment all the things that he'd gone through in his life, all these hard times or all these pitfalls that he'd had to endure and deal with. So Manasseh caused him to forget the bad times and caused him to think about the good times. And then it says that God made us forget all my hardships and my whole family. But I think he still remembered his family, his father especially. And then in verse 52, and the second son he named Ephraim, and said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. And some say Ephraim means fruitful. Some say it means fertile. Either way, he's productive, isn't he? And so God made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. And then verse 53 says, the 7 years of abundance in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in every land, but in the whole land of Egypt, there was food. And so out of that, we see that God's dream to Pharaoh not only was interpreted correctly, but God used Joseph and then blessed Joseph through the process out of it. That word devastate again is used there in verse 53, where it says the abundance in the land of Egypt came to an end. And you might say, well, that doesn't sound right, but it's the same word. It came to devastation. And now they've been in this abundance, and now it reaches this end. And so now the time of devastation is beginning. So it's an abrupt end. It signaled the coming of the famine, coming of the devastation. It's just the way Joseph had said. And soon God was going to be instrumental in causing other things to happen in the life of Joseph. So I don't know what kind of crises you might be going through in your life. I don't know what kind of difficulties you might be facing, or what kind of burdens you're bearing. But just remember that in the pitfalls of life, Joseph has gone through quite a bit and endured and made it out on top. You too can trust in God. And you might think, well, I'm trusting in God. It's not getting better. It's getting worse. I'm not only in 7 years of famine. I never saw the 7 years of good. But let me encourage you that you can overcome that. It's time for us to go. Our Sunday school lesson that we get for our the video that we get for our teachers, he said we need margins in our life, and that's what the 7 years taught, was you need to get a margin. And lots of financial planners today say the same thing. You need to get a margin in your life. Dave Ramsey talks about living on ramen noodles until you really build up the right kind of things, and getting those things set in place and leaving them in place, because someday you will need them. And so, but we need to marginalize our time as well. We need to marginalize our schedules. We need to marginalize our faith. We need to make sure that we are where we need to be in all those things. Well, God bless you all. And just a word before we go. Elmer Mays passed away this morning, and he's not been well, and he's been in the process for a few weeks, and then for sure in the last week. And so just pray for Joe and Matt and Lindsay and their families. And I'm sure this week will be a hard week for them, but God is good.